What if the most dangerous weapon in Westeros was never a dragon? What if it was a piece of parchment? What if the woman who understood that best was not the Dragon Queen sailing west with her fleet and her fire, but the one already sitting on the throne, cold-eyed, calculating, and patient in the way that only the truly ruthless can afford to be? The ravens arrive before dawn, 3 of them, their legs banded in the crimson and black of Qyburn's network, settling onto the perches in the small chamber beneath the Tower of the Hand, where the old Maester conducts his quietest work. He reads the dispatches twice. Then he folds them carefully, tucks them into the sleeve of his robe, and walks through the sleeping corridors of the Red Keep toward the Queen. Cersei is already awake. She is always already awake in these hours, standing at the narrow window of her solar, watching the city below as though daring it to move without her permission. She turns when Qyburn enters, and he sees in her expression what he has come to recognize as the particular stillness that precedes decision. Not contemplation, not doubt, but the quiet of a blade held at rest before it moves. He sets the documents before her, the annulment, the sworn testimonies, the lineage drawn out in careful ink by a Citadel Maester who understood, perhaps too late, that the information he possessed was not merely historical. Cersei reads, she does not rush. She reaches the final line and sets the parchment down with the deliberate ease of someone who had just confirmed what some part of her already suspected. Jon Snow is not Ned Stark's bastard. Jon Snow is Aegon Targaryen, the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, born of a secret marriage consecrated before a septon and recorded in ink that survived everything the world had done to erase it. He is not a bastard at all. He is, by every law of inheritance Westeros has ever recognized, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. She sends for Jaime before the candle has burned another inch. He arrives still pulling on his glove, reading her face the way he has always read her face, before a word is spoken. She slides the documents across the table. He reads them standing, and she watches him work through it. The first confusion, then the comprehension, then the tactical understanding arriving behind his eyes like light through a closing door. If Daenerys learns this before we act on it, Cersei says, she will either destroy him or kneel to him. Either outcome consolidates her position. She does not sit. She moves to the window again, the city below beginning to stir in the gray pre-dawn. But if the North learns it first, if every lord from the neck to the wall receives this document before she can shape how they receive it. Jaime does not finish the sentence. He does not need to. The North would fracture, not because northern lords do not love Jon Snow. They do fiercely in the way that men love leaders who bleed alongside them. But love and allegiance are different currencies, and the revelation of Jon's true name does not simply add to what he is. It transforms him into something the North never agreed to follow. He is no longer the king in the North, risen from among them. He is a Targaryen. He is the very dynasty the North broke itself to escape a generation ago. He is, by legal reckoning, the superior claimant to the very queen he has already bent his knee before, and that subordination, that gesture of deference, suddenly reads not as loyalty, but as strategy, as deception, as the careful maneuvering of a man who knew exactly who he was. The doubt alone is enough. Cersei understands this with the precision of someone who has spent her entire life navigating the distance between truth and the perception of truth. She does not need the North to believe Jon betrayed them. She only needs them to wonder. Qyburn, who has been silent in the corner with his hands folded, speaks now. The ravens can fly before midday. The Vale, the Reach, the Riverlands, every house of consequence. He pauses. Including the North. Include the North, Cersei says. She crosses to the writing table. She does not summon a scribe. She takes the quill herself, dips it, and begins to write in her own hand. The bold, angular script of a woman who understands that some documents carry more weight when signed by the fingers that ordered them. Her declaration is brief. It names him. It cites the annulment. It bears her seal. By the time the sun clears the bay, 30 ravens are being fitted with their sealed burdens in the rookery above, their small dark bodies restless against the brightening sky, waiting for the doors to open. The letter arrives at Winterfell before dawn fully claims the sky, carried by a bird that lands hard on the rookery beam, as though it too has been flying through something urgent, something that cannot wait. The master unrolls the parchment with careful fingers, reads it once in the half-dark, then reads it again. By the time the War Council assembles in the Great Hall, the fire burning low against the morning cold, the words have already begun their work. Sansa reads it aloud. Her voice does not waver. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the moment. Not the content of the letter, not the seal bearing Cersei's crowned lion in deep red wax, but the steadiness with which Sansa Stark delivers each line as though she has been training her whole life to receive exactly this kind of blow without flinching. She has been. The hall is very quiet. The fire pops. Someone's breath releases in a slow, controlled measure. Jon stands near the far wall, and his face is the face of a man watching the ground shift beneath his feet while refusing to reach for anything to steady himself. The words settle over the room like snow, soft at first. Then the weight of accumulation begins. The letter does not accuse. Accusation can be denied. What Cersei has written instead is a citation, dates, witnesses, a high septence record that should not exist but does. The careful language of a woman who knows that the most devastating documents are the ones that require no embellishment. She names Jon Snow. She names Rhaegar Targaryen. She names Lyanna Stark. And then she names the annulment. And in naming it, she names something else. A throne that does not currently belong to the woman sitting closest to it. Jon does not speak immediately. The silence he occupies is not the silence of guilt, but it is not easily distinguished from it. This is the masterstroke within the masterstroke. Cersei has not fabricated anything that the North would recognize as obviously false. She has simply illuminated something true at the worst possible angle, in the worst possible light, at the moment most calculated to do damage. The lords around the table look at one another with the particular expression of people recalibrating, repositioning, quietly revising the internal maps they have been navigating by. Across the water at Dragonstone, the same letter arrives within hours. Daenerys does not read it aloud. She reads it standing, and she reads it very still, and the stillness itself is a form of fury. The kind that has not yet decided what shape it will take. When she sets the parchment down on the table, she does not set it down gently. She asks Jon directly whether he knew. The question is not a question. It is a blade laid flat on a table between two people, and both of them understand that the next several minutes will determine whether it remains lying flat. Jon's answer, that he has only recently learned the truth of his own birth does not satisfy her, and she does not pretend that it does. What she wants is a denial, a public, unambiguous, politically binding denial. She wants him to say that Cersei is lying, to say it in front of witnesses, to hand her the ammunition she needs to dismiss the claim entirely and move forward as though the letter never arrived. Jon cannot give her that, and in the space between her demand and his inability to meet it, something fractures. Not completely, not irreparably, but enough that both of them can feel the crack running through the foundation of what they have built together. In a lower corridor, Tyrion speaks quietly to Varys, and his voice carries the particular exhausted admiration of a man who despises what he is being forced to acknowledge. "She didn't need an army for this," he says. Varys, who has spent a lifetime watching information move through the world like a current beneath still water, simply inclines his head. The revelation tears at two things simultaneously: the North's loyalty to Jon and Daenerys' trust in him. And it does this before a single sword has been drawn, before a single siege has begun, before any of the conventional instruments of war have had the chance to demonstrate their relevance. Cersei has fought the first battle entirely on paper, and she has won it. What remains to be seen is what Daenerys does next. She stands at the window above the sea, the letter still on the table behind her, and she is running through the calculations with the precision of someone who has never been able to afford the luxury of reacting before she has finished thinking. Her dragons are hers, her armies are hers, but the North she has never fully held, now holds something that she does not, and the shape of that asymmetry is still becoming clear when she turns from the window and calls for her advisors to assemble. The meeting convenes in the Great Hall's inner solar, a room chosen for its distance from servants and guards, and the particular kind of silence that comes only when walls are thick enough to swallow sound. Jon stands near the fire. Sansa sits straight backed at the table. Arya stands against the far wall the way she always stands, between exits, positioned for movement rather than ceremony. Daenerys arrives last, and she enters with the particular composure of someone who has been composing themselves since before the door opened. Bran speaks first. This is itself a kind of statement, because Bran does not speak in the way that other people speak. His words come from a place beyond recollection, beyond testimony, from somewhere the living are not supposed to be able to reach. He describes the Tower of Joy in the way a man describes something he has seen with his own eyes, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to dismiss. He names the names, he recounts the promises, he traces the lineage without flourish or hesitation, and when he finishes, the room does not erupt, because the room already knew, the way rooms know things before the people inside them have caught up. The fire crackles. No one fills the silence immediately. Jon confirms it. This is the part that costs him something visible, not the fact itself, which he has had time to carry, but the act of saying it in this room to these people, watching their faces absorb what his voice delivers. He does not expand upon it. He does not argue for it. He simply confirms it, and then he stands in the confirmation the way one stands in something that cannot be undone. Daenerys is watching him when he finishes, and what crosses her face is not a single thing, but a cascade of things arriving in rapid succession. Calculation and grief, and something that resembles territorial recognition. The instinct of someone who has constructed their identity around a singular claim, now encountering a structure that was always larger than they were told. She asks no questions. She is not the kind of person who asks questions when she is not yet certain what answers she can survive. She looks at him for a long time. Then she looks at Sansa. Sansa says nothing. She does not need to. The shape of her silence says precisely what it needs to say. By the following morning, the Unsullied have broken their encampment on the western approach and are moving east. Dothraki riders peel away from positions near the outer walls, their horses' breath rising in columns of frost above the hillside. The dragons circle once above Winterfell at dawn, slowly, deliberately, in a wide arc that could be interpreted as many things and is probably meant to be, and then bank northeast toward the coast. Word moves through the allied commanders faster than the riders do. Ser Davos receives the news in the armory and does not say anything for a long enough interval that the man who brought it begins to feel uncomfortable. Grey Worm ensures that the withdrawal is orderly, professional, and entirely without explanation, which is its own form of explanation. The Northern Lords read the movement of armies the way sailors read weather. The withdrawal does not go uninterpreted. By midday, riders from 2 southern houses within the Northern Coalition are requesting urgent audience with Lord Royce. By evening, 3 more have joined them. What they are saying, in the oblique language of men who are not yet ready to say it plainly, is that the Queen's armies have demonstrated something important about the nature of the alliance. That it was always conditional, that conditionality is a form of fragility, and that a king of northern blood who holds no dragons is nevertheless a king whose loyalty does not retract eastward to a coastline when the politics grow complicated. Other lords counsel restraint. They counsel it with genuine urgency. They understand, as the more eager do not, that choosing a side prematurely is not boldness. It is simply an early mistake. The coalition holds, technically, though everyone in it can feel the seam where it has begun to thin. Daenerys is not gone. Her forces remain within reach. She has paused, not departed, and the distinction matters, but the pause has already done its work. The shape of what people believe is now different from what it was 3 days ago, and belief, in wartime, is a kind of territory. Jon stands on the battlements in the late afternoon, watching the distant coastal horizon where the dragons have gone, and the question forming in the silence around him is not whether the truth has changed anything. It has changed everything. The question is whether anything can be rebuilt from the changed shape of it, and whether Daenerys, already calculating, always calculating, will allow that possibility before she decides it is a vulnerability she cannot afford. A raven arrives from the coast. He does not open it immediately. Far to the south, the raven that carries no news northward carries everything southward. Cersei Lannister stands at the high window of the Red Keep as the last of the afternoon light drains from the bay, and she is not watching the water. She is watching the reflection of herself in it. The controlled stillness of a woman who has waited longer than most people understand waiting to mean. The news from the north has reached her in pieces, as news always does, each piece slightly wrong in its details, but correct in its shape, and the shape is what she has been waiting for. A dragon queen and a resurrected king, and a secret that has shattered the trust between them. She does not smile. Smiling is for people who are surprised. The Golden Company's captain receives her terms in a private chamber 3 floors below, where anyone of consequence sleeps, and the meeting is not recorded, because Cersei has always understood that the most important agreements are the ones that leave no document behind. She does not need their swords yet. She needs their presence, the weight of 20,000 men sitting at the edge of the board, visible to everyone calculating odds. The pact she offers is not generous, it is precise. She gives them what they actually want, which is not gold but permanence. And she does so with the flat efficiency of someone who has negotiated under duress for long enough to know that desperation sounds exactly like clarity if spoken in the right register. The captain agrees before the candle has burned a quarter of the way down. King's Landing is reinforced quietly. Supply lines deepened. The city walls are assessed by men who walk them at dawn before the merchants have opened their stalls, taking measurements and noting weaknesses with the dispassion of physicians examining someone else's wound. Cersei has no intention of fighting a war. She has every intention of being the only ruler left standing when everyone else finishes fighting theirs. Stability, she understands, is its own kind of weapon. The slowest one, the heaviest one, the one that exhausts its enemies simply by continuing to exist while they exhaust themselves. Euron Greyjoy does not need to be asked twice. He needs, in truth, to be held back rather than encouraged. But Cersei gives him direction the way one gives direction to a fire, not by commanding it, but by choosing carefully what stands in its path. The raids begin near White Harbor within days. Not large engagements, surgical disruptions, ships appearing and vanishing before a proper response can be organized. Supply vessels intercepted in the gray mornings when the fog sits low on the water, and visibility is a matter of luck. Daenerys's position is not broken by this. It is complicated, which is precisely the point. A dragon queen does not redirect her dragons for complications unless the complications become undeniable, and Euron has a gift for making things undeniable. Drogon and Rhaegal turn south. The northern sky, already pale with cold, becomes emptier. The men guarding the approaches to the wall feel it before they understand it. A subtle change in the quality of the silence around them, as though something that had been pressed back is slowly remembering it was never truly stopped. The Night King does not accelerate. He does not need to. He simply continues, and continuing, in the absence of dragons, is enough. In the Lannister quarters of the keep, Jaime sits with a piece of parchment and does not write for a long time. He has listened to Cersei speak of positioning and pacts, and the beautiful logic of letting one's enemies destroy each other. And he has watched her face as she speaks. And what he has seen there is something he does not have a clean name for. Not madness, something colder. The willingness to let the world end, provided she is standing on whatever remains when it does. He picks up the quill. The letter he writes is not long. Long letters can be intercepted and read completely. Short ones can be memorized and burned. And he writes this one with burning in mind. He addresses it to Brienne of Tarth because she is the only person he trusts to act on honesty without first checking whether acting on it serves her position. He tells her what Cersei has done. He tells her what the absence of the dragons means for the Northern Front. He does not editorialize. He does not need to. The facts, arranged plainly, speak with more urgency than anything he could construct around them. He seals it with no sigil. He calls for a writer who does not know whose house he serves, only that the letter must move fast and arrive intact. The rider leaves before first light. Jaime stands at the window and watches the dark courtyard below. And when the sound of hooves fades into the city's ambient noise, he remains standing there, very still, as though the stillness itself is a kind of commitment he is making. Somewhere to the north, Jon Snow has still not opened his raven. The eastern wall does not fall with a sound that anyone remembers clearly afterward. That is the detail that haunts the survivors who flee south through the frozen dark. Not the cold, not the silence of the whites as they pour through the breach, but the absence of any single moment they can point to and say, "There, that was when it began." The wall simply ceases to hold. One section, already compromised by years of neglect and the slow retreat of men from their posts, gives way in the hours before dawn, and the army of the dead does not pour through so much as it accumulates, the way floodwater accumulates through a cracked foundation, steadily, with a patience that belongs to something that does not experience the passing of hours at all. Last hearth is gone by the time the first rider reaches Winterfell with the news. Gone in the way that only absolute cold can erase a place, not burned, not raised in the manner of armies that still require the warmth of fire to do their destruction, but simply emptied, its walls left standing as a kind of monument to what used to breathe inside them. The Umbers, what remains of them, scatter south along roads that have not seen this much desperate movement since the last Great War. They carry nothing except themselves. Most of them do not even carry that far. Jon knows before the rider arrives. He's been standing at the northern parapet of Winterfell in the gray pre-dawn, watching the horizon the way a man watches something he has been expecting and dreading in equal measure. And when the gate opens below him and he hears the particular quality of urgency in the hoofbeats, he is already moving. The news lands on him with the weight of confirmation rather than shock. This is the difference between a man who has fought the dead and a man who has only heard of them. The former is never truly surprised, only ever vindicated in the worst possible way. He rides north alone. This is not a decision that anyone around him endorses, but Jon Snow has never required endorsement for the things he knows he must do himself. The road north is bitter and lightless, the kind of cold that settles into the lungs and stays there, and he rides through it with his jaw set and his eyes moving across the tree line with the practiced attention of a man who understands that the stillness of the forest no longer means safety, if it ever did. He finds Tormund on a narrow road some miles south of where Last Hearth used to matter. Tormund is leading perhaps 40 wildlings, men and women both, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have already revised their expectations of the world downward and are prepared to revise them further. He pulls his horse to a stop when he sees Jon, and for a moment, neither of them speaks. The silence has the quality of men who have said everything necessary to each other before and are simply locating the thread of it again. Tormund speaks first. He says that dragons are impressive. He has seen them. He is not arguing against dragons, but a dragon used in the wrong direction at the wrong moment, or held back because the woman riding it is waiting for a political arrangement to resolve itself, is worth exactly nothing against what is coming down from the north right now. He says this without particular anger, which makes it land harder than anger would. He says that the living have days, not weeks, days, and he does not finish the thought after that. He does not need to. Jon brings him south to Winterfell. he brings all 40 of them. The emergency summit that convenes in the Great Hall that evening is not elegant. It is not the kind of council that produces careful language and measured compromise. It is the kind of council that happens when the wall between the living and the dead has developed a gap wide enough to walk an army through, and the people in the room have run out of the luxury of disagreement. Jon stands at the head of the table, not because anyone has placed him there, but because he is already standing when the others arrive. And something in his posture communicates that this particular arrangement of people in this particular room is not a negotiation. He produces a document, single page, written in his own hand, already witnessed by 2 men he trusts, in ways that have nothing to do with politics. He places it on the table without ceremony or preamble and says only that he relinquishes every claim, every title, every right of blood or lineage or any other foundation someone might wish to build a crown upon. His sword belongs to the living, nothing else. He asks only one thing in return. He looks across the table. Daenerys has not yet spoken, but her hands, resting flat against the wood of the table, have tightened almost imperceptibly, and across from her, Sansa watches those hands with the careful attention of a woman who has spent years learning to read what people cannot afford to say aloud. Daenerys does not move for a long moment. She looks at the document. She looks at Jon. And then she does something that no one in the room quite expects. She picks it up, reads it slowly, and sets it back down with the same flat, ceremonious precision with which he placed it. Her hands return to the wood. They do not tighten again. She says she accepts his terms. What follows is not warmth. It is not reconciliation in any romantic sense. What follows is the particular clarity that comes when 2 people who might have wanted something else from one another decide instead to want victory. The pact they forge in that room is stripped of everything decorative: dragons and northern cavalry, supply lines and staging positions, Sansa's knowledge of the land mapped against Daenerys' knowledge of fire, Jon standing between them like a translation, a man who speaks both languages and has elected to be useful rather than significant. Tyrion watches from the edge of the room and says nothing. He has said enough. The counsel he delivered before this meeting, that a queen who burns her way to a throne inherits only ash, that fear is not the same as loyalty, that the woman he chose to follow was not this woman not yet, but might still become her. That counsel has done its work. He recognizes the moment when an argument has already been decided and a man should simply allow it to settle. What if she had not listened? What if Tyrion's voice had arrived too late or landed on pride, too hardened to be moved? The answer to that question sits somewhere south of Winterfell, in the cold arithmetic of what an army without dragons and an army without northern knowledge become when each faces an enemy that does not tire and does not fear. She listened. That is what matters, and now the living have 2 dragons and a battle plan. Sansa's contribution to that plan is the thing that changes the shape of what comes. She does not speak the language of warfare in the way soldiers speak it. She does not talk about flanking positions or cavalry charges as abstractions. She talks about terrain the way someone talks about a room they have lived in for years. She knows where the ground hardens in winter, where it remains soft enough to slow a mass advance, where the tree lines create the illusion of cover without providing it. She knows that an enemy drawn forward by the appearance of vulnerability will move faster than an enemy that suspects a trap. She is describing, in the language of logistics, a killing field, a place where whites become predictable, a place where dragonfire finds its maximum efficiency. The generals look at the map, then they look at her. Jon says simply that they do it her way. The night the dead arrive is not a surprise. Bran has seen it coming for days, seen it in the particular stillness of his visions, the way the cold pressed south in patterns that had nothing to do with weather. He communicates what he knows through Samwell, who writes it down and delivers it at dawn with the particular urgency of a man who is still afraid but has learned to function inside that fear. By the time the first outriders return with confirmation, the positions are already set. Both dragons rise at the same moment. This is not canon. In the history that actually unfolded, the dragons met the darkness in chaos, reactive, responding to a battle already beginning to collapse. Here they rise together, coordinated. And the difference between those two versions of events is the difference between a torch held in a burning building and a controlled burn that devours the fuel before the fire reaches what must be protected. The whites come in their thousands. They come with the certainty of things that do not calculate risk, and that certainty is the weapon Sansa's plan turns against them. The northern cavalry falls back precisely far enough to draw the advance. The ground she identified holds. The dead compress into the killing field without understanding that they are being gathered rather than chasing. Drogon and Rhaegal descend into that compression from opposite angles, and what the fire finds is not a scattered line but a mass, a density of dead that burns like material, like something physical and combustible, like a mistake that has been waiting to be made. But the Night King does not fall to fire. He never has. He stands beyond the field, beyond the reach of flame, and the temperature around him drops in a way that the living can feel from a distance. A cold that is not weather, not winter, but something older than either. The dragons pull back. The cavalry holds its position. And Jon looks to Bran, who has been sitting motionless for hours, eyes white, somewhere else entirely. Somewhere inside the architecture of the enemy's oldest design. The dawn that followed the long night arrived beneath a sky so clear that many who witnessed it found themselves staring upward longer than necessary, as though they needed proof that the world still existed. Winterfell had survived. The dead had been defeated. Yet victory did not feel triumphant in the way songs often promised. It felt heavy. Every courtyard contained wounded men. Every hall contained empty seats. Every surviving lord carried the memory of faces that would never be seen again. Across the castle, funeral preparations had already begun. Pyres were raised beyond the walls, and the smell of fresh-cut wood mingled with smoke and snow. The survivors moved with the quiet exhaustion of people who had already accepted death and now found themselves burdened with the responsibility of continuing to live. For years, the realm had spoken of winter as though it were merely a season. Those who stood at Winterfell knew better. What had come for them was not winter, it was extinction. The fact that humanity remained standing at all felt almost miraculous. Daenerys spent much of that morning among the wounded, accompanied by Tyrion and Missandei. Jon moved through the castle in much the same way, speaking little, listening often, offering comfort where he could. The battle had changed both of them. Whatever tensions had existed between Queen and King before the long night seemed strangely distant now. They had faced the same darkness and emerged alive. There was a clarity in that experience that no political argument could erase. It was shortly after noon when the raven arrived. The bird bore the seal of the Iron Throne and carried a message that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Tyrion was the first to read it, and the expression that crossed his face immediately drew attention from everyone nearby. He read the letter twice before handing it to Daenerys without comment. The queen scanned the contents in silence, and for a moment, no one could tell whether she was amused or furious. Then she laughed, not because the message was funny, but because it was absurd. Cersei Lannister had declared herself sole ruler of a unified realm. The proclamation announced that the Northern Rebellion had effectively been destroyed, that the threat beyond the wall had either been exaggerated or eliminated, and that all surviving lords were expected to swear fresh oaths of fealty to the crown immediately. Reading the words in the aftermath of the long night felt almost surreal. While thousands had died defending the living from annihilation itself, the Queen in King's Landing had apparently spent her time drafting declarations of victory for battles she had never fought. The reaction among the assembled lords was immediate and unanimous. Anger spread through the hall faster than any fire. The Northern lords had already despised Cersei for abandoning them. Now they saw proof that she intended to exploit what she believed was their destruction. Men who rarely agreed on anything suddenly found themselves united in outrage. The Knights of the Vale felt much the same. They had marched north to defend the realm, only to discover that the woman occupying the Iron Throne had been preparing to benefit from their deaths. As the discussions continued throughout the day, a remarkable consensus began to emerge. The victory against the dead had changed the political landscape as thoroughly as it had changed the battlefield. The surviving lords no longer viewed Daenerys and Jon as separate leaders pursuing separate causes. They viewed them as the two people who had saved the world. By evening, the major houses of the North and the Vale formally petitioned both Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen to march south together. They offered not merely their armies, but their allegiance to a unified campaign. The war against the dead had ended. The struggle for the future of the realm would now begin. Yet before any march could occur, one final issue demanded resolution. Jon's parentage still lingered over every political discussion like a shadow. Cersei's revelation had failed to destroy the alliance between Jon and Daenerys, but uncertainty remained among many lesser lords. Some feared that a future conflict between the two claims might eventually fracture the peace they had fought so hard to preserve. Others simply wanted clarity. The question of succession could not be allowed to fester. 3 days later, Winterfell's great courtyard, filled with thousands of soldiers, nobles, and survivors, gathered to witness an event unlike any Westeros had seen before. Jon stood before them, wearing the colors of House Stark. Beside him stood Daenerys Targaryen, flanked by her advisors and commanders. The cold wind carried their banners overhead while the crowd waited in near silence. When Jon spoke, he did not hide behind half-truths or evasions. He told them exactly who he was. He spoke of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. He acknowledged the legitimacy of his birth and the strength of his claim. Most importantly, he explained why he would not pursue it. He had never desired the Iron Throne. He had never fought for crowns. Every choice he had made had been guided by duty rather than ambition, and nothing about the revelation of his parentage had changed that. When he finished, Daenerys stepped forward. Many expected her to demand loyalty. Instead, she offered compromise. The Queen announced that the North would retain broad authority over its own affairs. Northern customs, laws, and traditions would remain untouched. Local governance would continue under Northern leadership, while the Crown would concern itself primarily with the defense and unity of the realm as a whole. It was neither complete independence nor complete submission. It was something entirely new. The proposal transformed the mood of the gathering almost instantly. Northern pride remained intact. The authority of the Crown remained recognized. What conquest could never have achieved, compromise accomplished in a single afternoon. The cheers that followed echoed across Winterfell's walls. For the first time since Cersei's secret had entered the world, the realm seemed to possess a path forward that did not end in civil war. The dead had been defeated. The alliance had survived. And now, with the North united behind both Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, the road south lay open before them. The dawn that followed the long night arrived beneath a sky so clear that many who witnessed it found themselves staring upward longer than necessary, as though they needed proof that the world still existed. Winterfell had survived. The dead had been defeated. Yet victory did not feel triumphant in the way songs often promised. It felt heavy. Every courtyard contained wounded men. Every hall contained empty seats. Every surviving lord carried the memory of faces that would never be seen again. Across the castle, funeral preparations had already begun. Pyres were raised beyond the walls, and the smell of fresh-cut wood mingled with smoke and snow. The survivors moved with the quiet exhaustion of people who had already accepted death and now found themselves burdened with the responsibility of continuing to live. For years, the realm had spoken of winter as though it were merely a season. Those who stood at Winterfell knew better. What had come for them was not winter. It was extinction. The fact that humanity remained standing at all felt almost miraculous. Daenerys spent much of that morning among the wounded, accompanied by Tyrion and Missandei. Jon moved through the castle in much the same way, speaking little, listening often, offering comfort where he could. The battle had changed both of them. Whatever tensions had existed between Queen and King before the long night seemed strangely distant now. They had faced the same darkness and emerged alive. There was a clarity in that experience that no political argument could erase. It was shortly after noon when the Raven arrived. The bird bore the seal of the Iron Throne and carried a message that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Tyrion was the first to read it, and the expression that crossed his face immediately drew attention from everyone nearby. He read the letter twice before handing it to Daenerys without comment. The Queen scanned the contents in silence, and for a moment, no one could tell whether she was amused or furious. Then she laughed, not because the message was funny, but because it was absurd. Cersei Lannister had declared herself sole ruler of a unified realm. The proclamation announced that the Northern Rebellion had effectively been destroyed, that the threat beyond the wall had either been exaggerated or eliminated, and that all surviving lords were expected to swear fresh oaths of fealty to the crown immediately. Reading the words in the aftermath of the long night felt almost surreal. While thousands had died defending the living from annihilation itself, the Queen in King's Landing had apparently spent her time drafting declarations of victory for battles she had never fought. The reaction among the assembled lords was immediate and unanimous. Anger spread through the hall faster than any fire. The Northern lords had already despised Cersei for abandoning them. Now they saw proof that she intended to exploit what she believed was their destruction. Men who rarely agreed on anything suddenly found themselves united in outrage. The Knights of the Vale felt much the same. They had marched north to defend the realm, only to discover that the woman occupying the Iron Throne had been preparing to benefit from their deaths. As the discussions continued throughout the day, a remarkable consensus began to emerge. The victory against the dead had changed the political landscape as thoroughly as it had changed the battlefield. The surviving lords no longer viewed Daenerys and Jon as separate leaders pursuing separate causes. They viewed them as the two people who had saved the world. By evening, the major houses of the North and the Vale formally petitioned both Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen to march south together. They offered not merely their armies, but their allegiance to a unified campaign. The war against the dead had ended. The struggle for the future of the realm would now begin. Yet before any march could occur, one final issue demanded resolution. Jon's parentage still lingered over every political discussion like a shadow. Cersei's revelation had failed to destroy the alliance between Jon and Daenerys, but uncertainty remained among many lesser lords. Some feared that a future conflict between the two claims might eventually fracture the peace they had fought so hard to preserve. Others simply wanted clarity. The question of succession could not be allowed to fester. 3 days later, Winterfell's great courtyard filled with thousands of soldiers, nobles, and survivors gathered to witness an event unlike any Westeros had seen before. Jon stood before them, wearing the colors of House Stark. Beside him stood Daenerys Targaryen, flanked by her advisors and commanders. The cold wind carried their banners overhead, while the crowd waited in near silence. When Jon spoke, he did not hide behind half-truths or evasions. He told them exactly who he was. He spoke of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. He acknowledged the legitimacy of his birth and the strength of his claim. Most importantly, he explained why he would not pursue it. He had never desired the Iron Throne. He had never fought for crowns. Every choice he had made had been guided by duty rather than ambition, and nothing about the revelation of his parentage had changed that. When he finished, Daenerys stepped forward. Many expected her to demand loyalty. Instead, she offered compromise. The Queen announced that the North would retain broad authority over its own affairs. Northern customs, laws, and traditions would remain untouched. Local governance would continue under Northern leadership, while the Crown would concern itself primarily with the defense and unity of the realm as a whole. It was neither complete independence nor complete submission. It was something entirely new. The proposal transformed the mood of the gathering almost instantly. Northern pride remained intact. The authority of the Crown remained recognized. What conquest could never have achieved, compromise accomplished in a single afternoon. The cheers that followed echoed across Winterfell's walls. For the first time since Cersei's secret had entered the world, the realm seemed to possess a path forward that did not end in civil war. The dead had been defeated. The alliance had survived. And now, with the North united behind both Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, the road south lay open before them. The march south began beneath skies that seemed almost unnaturally calm. For years, the people of Westeros had spoken of winter as an approaching catastrophe, a darkness gathering beyond the horizon. Now that darkness had come and gone, leaving behind a realm that was battered but alive. Yet as the combined armies departed Winterfell and turned toward King's Landing, many understood that survival alone would not secure the future. The dead had been defeated, but the living remained divided by ambition, fear, and old grievances that had not disappeared simply because a greater enemy had briefly united them. News traveled faster than armies ever could. Merchants, riders, and wandering survivors carried tales of the long night from castle to castle. By the time Daenerys' host crossed the neck, stories of the battle had spread throughout nearly every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. Some accounts claimed the dead had numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Others insisted that dragons had blotted out the stars themselves. The details varied with each telling, but the conclusion remained the same. The Night King was dead, the armies of Winterfell had prevailed, and most importantly, Daenerys Targaryen now marched south with 2 living dragons at her command. The consequences of those stories became visible long before the Allied host approached King's Landing. Cersei's coalition had been built upon a simple assumption that the North would be crippled by the war against the dead, leaving the Iron Throne free to deal with whatever survivors remained. The moment that assumption collapsed, so too did much of the loyalty she had purchased. The Golden Company, despite its reputation, consisted of soldiers rather than fanatics. They were professionals who fought for profit, not destiny. Many had crossed oceans expecting a conventional war. What they found instead were reports of dragons, undead armies, and a queen whose forces had defeated a threat that sounded more like mythology than warfare. Desertions began quietly at first. A handful of men disappeared from encampments during the night. Then entire groups vanished. Officers discovered abandoned tents and empty supply wagons. Rumors spread through the ranks faster than discipline could contain them. Men who had spent their lives calculating odds looked at the prospect of fighting dragons and decided that no amount of gold was worth becoming a cautionary tale. Each desertion weakened Cersei's position further. Meanwhile, the alliance between North and South continued to strengthen. The public ceremony at Winterfell had achieved something many believed impossible. By formally recognizing the North's autonomy while preserving the unity of the realm, Daenerys had removed the greatest obstacle standing between her and lasting legitimacy. Northern lords who once viewed her with suspicion now marched willingly beneath her banners. They did not necessarily love her, but they respected the compromise she had offered, and in politics, respect often proves more durable than affection. Jon understood this perhaps better than anyone. Throughout the march, he found himself occupying a role unlike any he had expected. He was no longer merely a northern king, nor a secret claimant to the throne. Instead, he had become a bridge between worlds that had spent generations distrusting one another. Men who might never have listened to Daenerys listened to Jon. Southern nobles who viewed northern independence with concern found reassurance in his support of the new arrangement. Without intending to, he had become one of the central pillars holding the alliance together. It was near Harrenhal that another unexpected development altered the course of events. The lone rider appeared shortly after dawn, carrying no banners and escorted by no soldiers. Scouts intercepted him several miles ahead of the main army and quickly realized the significance of the man approaching their lines. Jaime Lannister had come alone. Word spread rapidly through the camp, and by the time he was escorted before Daenerys and her advisors, hundreds of soldiers had gathered nearby, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous Kingslayer. Many expected a trap, Others expected an attempt at negotiation. What they received instead was a surrender. Jaime offered no excuses. He spoke honestly, perhaps for the first time in many years. He admitted that Cersei had no intention of negotiating in good faith. He confirmed that she remained determined to cling to power regardless of the cost to the realm. Most importantly, he provided something infinitely more valuable than apologies: information. Maps of the capital, guard deployments, defensive preparations, wildfire storage locations, hidden entrances beneath the Red Keep. Every secret he possessed became a weapon handed directly to the people preparing to overthrow his sister. Tyrion was the first to believe him. Perhaps that should not have been surprising. Despite everything that had happened between them, Tyrion still understood Jaime better than most men alive. Jon followed soon after. Daenerys remained cautious longer than either of them, but even she could not ignore the practical value of the intelligence he provided. By the end of the day, Jaime Lannister had become something few would have predicted months earlier: a useful ally. Far to the south, however, Cersei's position deteriorated with alarming speed. The news arriving in King's Landing grew worse with each passing day. Reports confirmed the Night King's defeat. Reports confirmed the survival of Daenerys' dragons. Reports confirmed that northern armies remained intact. Then came confirmation that Jaime had abandoned her. For perhaps the first time since taking the throne, Cersei found herself confronting a reality she could neither manipulate nor deny. Her strategy had failed. The North had survived. The Alliance had survived. And now the consequences were marching directly toward her gates. Qyburn, always pragmatic beneath his loyalty, recognized the danger immediately. He advised caution. He suggested exploring terms while favorable conditions remained possible. It was not surrender he proposed, but negotiation, a chance to preserve some measure of influence before complete defeat became inevitable. The suggestion proved fatal. Cersei had built her entire life around control. The moment she realized events had escaped that control, fear began transforming into paranoia. Every setback became evidence of betrayal. Every disagreement became disloyalty. When Qyburn proposed negotiation, she no longer heard strategy. She heard weakness. The order was given almost casually. The mountain obeyed instantly. Qyburn died without understanding how thoroughly the Queen's judgment had deteriorated. Afterward, Cersei withdrew deeper into the Red Keep. Advisors disappeared from public view. Access became restricted. Decisions emerged from behind closed doors with increasing unpredictability. The Queen, who had once manipulated kingdoms, now found herself isolated within her own fortress, surrounded by fewer allies than she realized and more enemies than she could count. Outside the city, the Allied host continued its advance. Inside the city, Cersei prepared for a final confrontation she was increasingly unlikely to win. And somewhere between those two forces stood King's Landing itself, a city filled with ordinary people who had survived too many wars already and now waited anxiously to discover whether this one would finally be the last. By the time the Allied host reached the outskirts of King's Landing, it had become increasingly clear that the final battle for the Iron Throne would not resemble any of the wars that had come before it. The city had expected siege engines, starvation, and months of bloodshed. Instead, it found itself facing an army that had already defeated death itself. The stories arriving ahead of Daenerys' forces had done almost as much damage to Cersei's position as dragons ever could. every merchant caravan, every wandering traveler, every frightened deserter carried the same message southward. The Night King was dead, the dragons lived, and the Queen marching toward King's Landing commanded the loyalty of nearly every major force left in Westeros. Inside the capital, fear spread through the streets faster than any official proclamation could contain it. The small folk had endured years of war, political upheaval, famine, and uncertainty. Many remembered the destruction caused during the War of the Five Kings. Others remembered stories of the Mad King and the devastation dragonfire could bring. They looked toward the northern horizon and saw the approach of another conflict, wondering whether their homes would survive it. Yet Daenerys had no intention of allowing King's Landing to become another battlefield if it could be avoided. The discussions held outside the city walls lasted long into the night. Tyrion argued passionately against any plan that risked widespread civilian casualties. Jon supported him. The victory against the dead had been achieved to save the realm, not to destroy it afterward. Daenerys listened carefully. Months earlier, she might have viewed restraint as weakness, but the events surrounding Jon's parentage and the alliance forged in the north had changed her perspective. She understood now that the throne alone was not the prize. The future of the realm was. When dawn arrived, messengers rode toward the city, carrying terms of surrender. The offer was simple. Open the gates, lay down arms, no sack, no massacre, no dragonfire. The city would be spared. At first, many inside King's Landing assumed it was a trick. Years of living beneath Cersei's rule had conditioned people to distrust promises. But as the hours passed and no attack came, something remarkable began to happen. Rumors spread through marketplaces and taverns. The city's defenders heard stories from deserters and travelers. They learned that the northern armies had honored their agreements. They learned that Daenerys had accepted compromise with the north rather than attempting to crush it. Most importantly, they learned that surrender would actually be honored. The realization changed everything. The pressure that had been building beneath the surface for weeks finally erupted. City guards abandoned posts. Minor officials quietly fled. Merchants began urging neighbors to avoid resistance altogether. By midday, groups of citizens had gathered near the gates, demanding that the city be spared. Then the bells began to ring, not as a signal of alarm, as a signal of surrender. The sound spread across King's Landing like a wave moving through water. One bell became 10. 10 became 50. Before long, the entire city echoed with the unmistakable declaration that the fighting was over. The gates opened from within. No dragon broke them. No army battered them down. The people of King's Landing opened them themselves. For a brief moment, it appeared that the war would end without bloodshed. But Jaime Lannister knew his sister too well to trust appearances. The moment word of the surrender reached him, a terrible suspicion took hold. Cersei had spent years preparing contingencies for defeat. She trusted almost no one and believed absolutely nothing should be left to chance. If she had accepted surrender so easily, there had to be another plan. The answer revealed itself quickly. Wildfire, hidden beneath the city in caches left behind from the reign of Aerys II, and supplemented over the years by Cersei's own preparations. Enough to transform entire districts into burning graves. Enough to kill tens of thousands. Enough to ensure that if she could not keep the city, no one else would possess it either. Jaime understood the danger immediately because he had seen something similar before. Years earlier, he had killed one king to prevent the destruction of King's Landing. Now history threatened to repeat itself. Without hesitation, he gathered a small group of trusted men and descended into the tunnels beneath the city. What followed was a desperate race against time. The hidden passages beneath King's Landing were ancient, confusing, and dangerous even under normal circumstances. Navigating them while searching for wildfire caches turned the task into a nightmare. One by one, they located storage chambers concealed behind false walls and forgotten passages. Some were successfully neutralized. Others required being flooded or dismantled entirely. Hours passed. The city above celebrated surrender while a second battle unfolded beneath its streets. Then disaster struck. One cache ignited prematurely. The explosion shook entire sections of the underground tunnels. Men were thrown from their feet. Stone cracked. Fire surged through narrow corridors with terrifying speed. Jaime survived only because he shielded another soldier with his own body at the last possible moment. The burns he suffered were severe. His armor melted against his skin in places. Smoke filled his lungs. Yet, somehow he continued. By the time the final wildfire stores had been rendered harmless, Jaime could barely stand. But the city remained intact. For the second time in his life, the man history remembered as the Kingslayer had saved King's Landing from destruction. Above ground, the final chapter of Cersei's reign was already unfolding. The Queen remained within the Red Keep, long after her supporters had abandoned hope. Advisors had fled. Soldiers had surrendered. The city itself had chosen peace over loyalty. Yet, she refused to leave the throne room, perhaps because she could not imagine life without power. Perhaps because she understood that everything she had built was ending. When the great doors finally opened, the room beyond was almost empty. Daenerys entered first. Jon followed beside her. Then came Tyrion, Grey Worm, and representatives from the armies that had marched together from Winterfell. Outside, Drogon descended into the courtyard with a thunderous impact that seemed to shake the entire castle. The sound echoed through stone walls and ancient halls, a reminder that the age Cersei had spent years trying to prevent had finally arrived. For a long moment, no one spoke. Cersei stood beside the Iron Throne, staring at the people who had defeated her. There was no anger left in her expression, no confidence, no certainty, only exhaustion. The realization had finally reached her. Every scheme had failed. Every alliance had collapsed. Every lie had eventually encountered reality. The secret she had hoped would divide her enemies had united them. The war she expected would destroy the North had elevated its leaders. The dragons she dismissed as distant threats now stood outside her own walls. For perhaps the first time in her life, there was no manipulation left to attempt, no move left to make, no victory left to claim. And so, without ceremony or dramatic final speech, Cersei Lannister surrendered. Not because she accepted defeat, because defeat had already accepted her. The war for the Iron Throne ended not with fire, but with judgment. In many ways, that fact alone distinguished this timeline from countless darker possibilities that had haunted the realm for generations. King's Landing still stood. Its streets were crowded rather than burned. Its people remained frightened, certainly, but they remained alive. The city had survived a queen willing to destroy it, a war that could have consumed it, and the ambitions of rulers who, under different circumstances, might have chosen conquest over restraint. The victory belonged not to any single individual, but to a series of choices that had steadily pulled Westeros away from catastrophe. Cersei Lannister's trial began less than a week after her surrender. Representatives from every major region of the realm attended. Northern lords sat beside Reach nobles. Knights of the Vale shared chambers with river lords and storm lords. The gathering resembled less a criminal proceeding and more a reckoning for an entire generation of conflict. The woman standing accused had shaped the political fate of Westeros for years, and the consequences of her decisions stretched far beyond the walls of King's Landing. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Witnesses testified regarding her role in countless betrayals, conspiracies, and abuses of power. Records recovered from the Red Keep confirmed the existence of hidden wildfire caches beneath the city. Surviving advisors spoke openly about the paranoia that had consumed her final months in power. Even those who had once supported her found little reason to defend what had become impossible to justify. Yet perhaps the strangest moment of the proceedings arrived when discussion turned to Jon Snow. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, Cersei had built her influence through deception. She had manipulated truth, twisted perception, and weaponized uncertainty whenever it served her interests. Yet the revelation that ultimately destroyed her position had been one of the few entirely truthful acts of her political career. Jon Snow really was the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. He really did possess a stronger legal claim to the Iron Throne than Daenerys herself. The secret she had hoped would fracture the alliance between North and South had achieved precisely the opposite. By revealing the truth too early, Cersei had accidentally forced everyone involved to confront it honestly. Daenerys had been compelled to choose cooperation over fear. Jon had been compelled to publicly define his position. The Northern Lords had been compelled to decide what mattered more, bloodlines or trust. In attempting to create division, she had unintentionally created clarity. History rarely rewards irony, but it often enjoys it. When the trial concluded, many expected execution. Instead, the sentence surprised nearly everyone present. Daenerys rejected calls for public spectacle. Tyrion argued strongly against creating another martyr. Jon agreed. The realm had buried enough ghosts already. It did not need another. Cersei Lannister was stripped of every title, every privilege, and every remaining claim to power. She would spend the rest of her life confined to a small island fortress under permanent guard, removed entirely from politics, inheritance, and public influence. No songs would celebrate her. No monuments would honor her. No legacy would remain for future generations to inherit. For a woman who had spent her life chasing power, obscurity represented a punishment more severe than death. And so Cersei disappeared from history, not with a dramatic final act, but with a quiet absence. The realm moved on without her. Months later, the Great Council assembled to resolve the final question that still lingered over Westeros. Who would rule? The answer seemed obvious to some. Jon Snow possessed the strongest legal claim. His parentage had been verified beyond reasonable doubt. Many northern lords would gladly have supported him. Several southern houses quietly expressed the same preference. To them, Jon represented a rare combination of legitimacy, humility, and proven leadership. Others supported Daenerys. She had crossed the world to fight for the realm. She had committed her armies and dragons against the dead when she could have remained focused solely on conquest. She had accepted compromise, when many conquerors would have demanded submission. Most importantly, she had demonstrated the ability to listen, adapt, and place stability above pride. The debate lasted days. In another timeline, such disagreement might have sparked a civil war. Here, it ended because of Jon himself. When he finally rose to address the council, the chamber fell silent almost immediately. By that point, many suspected what he intended to say. Even so, hearing the words spoken aloud carried a weight that no rumor could match. Jon acknowledged his claim. He acknowledged the truth of his birth. He acknowledged that by every traditional measure, the throne could be his if he wished it. Then he refused it, not reluctantly, not uncertainly, completely. For much of his life, people had attempted to make decisions for him based upon bloodlines: bastard, Stark, Targaryen, king. He had spent years being defined by names he never chose. Standing before the Great Council, he finally defined himself instead. He did not want the throne. He never had. The realm needed peace more than it needed another succession dispute, and he had no intention of allowing his existence to become the spark that ignited one. The decision changed everything. With Jon's support secured publicly and irrevocably, the council moved quickly. Daenerys Targaryen was formally recognized as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. The agreement forged at Winterfell remained intact. The North retained its special autonomous status beneath the crown. Local governance remained in northern hands. The realm remained united. It was not a perfect solution. No political arrangement ever is. But it worked. And after decades of war, that was enough. The years that followed became known not for conquest, but for recovery. Roads were rebuilt, trade resumed. Castles damaged during years of conflict were repaired. Families separated by war slowly found their way back together. For the first time in a generation, the people of Westeros spent more time planning futures than surviving disasters. Daenerys proved a more measured ruler than many had expected. The lessons learned during the crisis surrounding Jon's identity remained with her long after the throne became secure. She governed with greater patience than before, relying heavily on counsels rather than commands. Tyrion continued serving his hand. Samwell Tarly became one of the most influential scholars in the realm. Sansa strengthened northern institutions and gradually transformed Winterfell into the political center of a north more prosperous than it had been in decades. And Jon? Jon returned home, not because he was defeated, not because he was exiled, because for perhaps the first time in his life, he had the freedom to choose where he belonged. The final years of war had forced him into roles he never sought: bastard, commander, king. He had carried responsibilities large enough to shape the fate of continents, yet none of those titles had ever truly reflected what mattered most to him. What mattered was Winterfell. What mattered was the North. What mattered was the family and people he had spent his life protecting. Years later, on a quiet morning, long after the last armies had returned south, Jon stood atop the battlements of Winterfell, watching the sunrise spread across the snow-covered fields beyond the castle. Below him, the courtyard was already beginning to stir with ordinary life. Stable hands prepared horses. Guards changed shifts. Children chased one another across the yard without any understanding of how close the world had once come to ending. The sight made him smile, not because every problem had been solved, not because the future was guaranteed, but because life had returned. The dead were gone, the wars were over, the realm remained intact. And for the first time in many years, there was no prophecy waiting to be fulfilled, no crown demanding to be claimed, and no secret threatening to tear everything apart. Only peace. As the sun rose higher above the walls of Winterfell, Jon Snow remained where he was, watching a new day begin. The realm behind him had been changed forever by truth, by sacrifice, and by choices that could easily have gone another way. Yet somehow it had endured, not perfectly, but whole, and in the end, that was enough.